know, it may just be me, but I really got a feeling like we could catch fire and have a great season, huh? Now, who's with me?
Woo! The electric in the air!
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be
The Cleats First, Logic Second Football Podcast with your hosts, Alexander Lauber and Phil Almodovar.
Welcome back, one and all, to the Cleats First, Logic Second Football Podcast, where this week we'll be going into some interesting news surrounding the March 22nd international break. Some really crucial from the Manchester United camp. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer making the news the other day. Alex, let's jump right into it and have you explain what exactly happened.
So, as we know, when it comes to England and their restrictions regarding the pandemic, there are a number of countries that are listed under red list. Being a red list country means that when you return from that country to England, you'll have to be forced into a quarantine for 10 days. And with a number of Ole's players from Brazil, Alex Telles and Fred specifically, Portugal in Bruno Fernandes, and Uruguay with Edison Cavani, all of these players would be forced into that mandatory 10-day quarantine following that international break, which means they obviously would miss crucial fixtures. Ole was, when asked about this in a press conference, basically came out and said that they're not outright banning them from going, but those discussions are ongoing. As he said, we're the ones paying the players, and from what I understand, that's the rule. FIFA have given us the rule that they don't have to be released. So I would think that's going to be a hard call to make to let them go and play in red list countries. So following this, Southampton and Liverpool both have came out and said that they will follow suit, saying that if there is a quarantine for leaving and returning, they don't want their players to leave. So this is understandable, Phil, but let's put some context into this. The pandemic isn't the first time that we've seen teams restrict their players from going out on international duty, especially during a domestic season.
Yes, Alex. And to add a little bit more to the end of that, yes, Huddle and Klopp both have come out saying that they don't want their players to leave either. Today, just today, Pep Guardiola and Bielsa have joined that train as well. So, like you said, Alex, so this isn't the first time, although it's definitely in the biggest magnitude of not letting players leave, or not wanting to let players leave, I should say. There's never been an instance where players have been forced by their manager to stay at the club. However, managers have implied that they would like their players to stay and not go on international duty. And just a couple of those instances, if you don't remember, a few years ago, Bayern with Manuel Neuer, of course, Manuel Neuer in a deep fight with Marc-Andre ter Stegen for the top spot as the German national team goalkeeper. Neuer's manager at the time said to Manuel that if he was not starting for Germany, he would not want Manuel Neuer to go join the German national team for the German international break for friendlies. Neuer, of course, did not listen to this. He still went anyway. But that was an instance, at the very least, the most recent instance of a player being told maybe you shouldn't go. Also, going back a little bit further, there was, of course, the many instances with Sir Alex Ferguson, one of the best managers of all time, telling some of his players, multiple of his players, of course, for example, Vidic, Scholes, the better ones too, not, any small players, saying that if their countries are just playing in friendlies and not in the World Cup, the Euros, anything like that, they shouldn't go because the games don't mean anything. So interesting to see the different reasonings there behind having those players stay. Another being too, and this didn't happen with Van Persie. He didn't end up being told to stay. But of course, the big instance with Van Persie, if you don't know the instance with Van Persie and Arsene Wenger, back when Van Persie was at Arsenal, he left for international duty with the Netherlands. He, of course, got injured in one of the games with the Netherlands, had a bad knee injury, The Netherlands medical staff said that it was a minor injury and he would only be out 4 to 6 weeks. He came back to Arsenal and was reevaluated for the injury, where it was apparent that he would be out much longer, leaving Arsene Wenger to much dismay. And now we've also seen, too, a lot going on with the MLS in the past couple years with players going on international duty, as unlike with Europe, with the MLS, players going on international duty actually affects the teams, the clubs themselves, because the clubs are forced to play actual matches without those players. The MLS has been forced to do this for a while now, and it's come to the fact where managers have told players, maybe you shouldn't go. So there have been many instances for many different reasons why managers have tried to get their players not to go on international duty. Of course, none of them being successful. Alex, is this fair for the managers to put in a word saying you shouldn't go?
Well, like many arguments, Phil, there's two sides to this story, and I think it's only fair that we look at both sides and make the arguments for both the players, why they should be allowed to go, and the manager, why they should be able to decide whether or not the players go. So why don't we just start off with the players and the player perspective. So when you look on behalf of the players, it's a high honor to be playing at the international level and to get international caps. If you look at, again, the countless players who proudly wear their international badge and proudly represent their countries, like I said, it's a high honor. And for a lot of these countries, your big countries, your Italy, your England, your Germany, your Spain, Portugal, what have you, these teams are cutthroat. There's 3 or 4 players playing in your same position, and if you can't make international caps, regardless how good you're playing at the club level, if these players are showing up and playing your position better than you are while you're forced to stay behind, you're going to ultimately lose your starting spot on the national team. Because at the end of the day, very few players are 100% guaranteed that spot on the roster, regardless of current form.
Yes, Alex. And if you look at it from just a performance perspective, going back to the Sir Alex Ferguson reason, which I'm going to talk about all the reasons and how they impact this question. The Alex Ferguson reasoning that friendlies don't matter. Friendlies do matter in the scheme of things, as boring as they are to watch, because obviously the result doesn't go into any sort of tournament, any sort of ranking, really. It still matters in the fact that a lot of these players are playing for a position in the national team, whether it be the starting 11 or amongst the subs, for the bigger tournaments. And it's not just fringe players, it's players like Manuel Neuer at some points battling with Marc-Andre ter Stegen for the starting goalkeeper spot. It's players like, if you want to go more in depth too, it's players like Mason Mount and Declan Rice battling for midfield spots in the English squad. These aren't, fringe players. These players are some of the better players in their country, and they still have to go on these international duties for that reputation to keep up that high standard and keep them in the starting 11. And if you don't go, that could be paving the way for the player that's right behind you to jump ahead of you, which I think is the biggest argument in saying that you shouldn't be able to, for any reason, withhold a player.
Yeah, and while the upcoming international break will be, I believe, for several countries, World Cup qualifying games, at that same point, if you are a bigger country playing in those matches, you're not necessarily going to be too worried about having to play your strongest possible 11. You're not approaching those like you would a World Cup final, per se. But at the same time, you still want your strongest players there. And if you're these players, you're going to want to go show up and show why you deserve to play, again, at the international level, consistently in the starting 11. And I think it's fair to say we'll talk more about form when we talk about the manager's perspective. But from a player's perspective, if you're on a bit of a lull, going to international duty could be a good change of environment, and you could argue that if you go with that new group of players, if something sparks, if you're a striker, a forward, and you score a couple of goals while on your couple of games with the international team, there's a good chance that that could carry back to the club level and you can continue gunning from there. But inversely, Phil, why don't we jump over to the manager perspective? Why don't you run us through a couple of reasons why managers wouldn't necessarily be very fond of their players going off during international duty, especially during these times?
Well, first off, Alex, I think it's clear from the Wenger example I gave earlier that in these games, adverse things could happen to your players. Unfortunate things could happen to your players. They can get injured. Injuries are unfortunately a part of the game. Players can get injured on international duty and not be able to play for stretches of time during the season. Also, just like that as well, players now with the COVID-19 pandemic can get COVID, and that's more than just a 10-day quarantine. If you get COVID while on international duty, that could leave you out for a lengthy period of time, depending on how badly you get it. So it's a risk for these managers to be sending out their players. And I say their players because, like Ole Gunnar Solskjaer said, he's the one paying them. He's the one paying them. He is the one or Manchester United is the team that these players are under contract with, not England, Brazil, Uruguay. It's Manchester United. So he's taking up a lot more risk having his players go out than the Brazilian national team, the Uruguayan national team to a degree. So that I feel like is the spark to this argument, in the fact that if some of these key players for your squad do go out and something bad does happen, it could be detrimental to the club.
Look, and yeah, I don't think it's as greedy as clubs just being like, no, they're my players, I don't want them playing. It's fair from a manager's perspective, especially during this season, with how compact the schedule is. There are some teams who are playing 3 matches in 7 days. It's really, really intensive, and there's a number of players who are playing the majority of minutes for club, but who are even playing the majority of minutes for their national team. So if we look, for example, staying with the Arsenal, if we look at Bukayo Saka, earlier in the season, he was playing the majority of minutes for club, but also going out on international duty. And he would be playing, I think there was one international break where there were 3 or 4 matches, and he played every single 90 in that time. So for players, you don't want to risk that overexposure and that risk of injury. So a manager is fair to say, well, if we rely heavily on this player to play for us, a couple extra 90s under his belt won't do him as much good as it is potential risk for them getting hurt seriously. And then, like you said, there's an overabundance of picks. If Manchester United goes and lets Bruno go out on international duty, and Bruno gets hurt while gone, Portugal will be fine. Portugal has several number 10s they can reach down and replace Bruno with. While not necessarily at the same level of Bruno, there's still a wide variety. If you look at Manchester United, if Bruno gets hurt, there isn't a number 10 at the same quality of Bruno on that roster.
And Alex, you could argue too that Bruno in a Portuguese uniform in World Cup qualifiers, yeah, they'll be playing against some good countries, but they're playing against countries that are also, I don't know exactly who's in their World Cup qualifying group. I don't know if it's been picked yet, but they'll be playing against the Faroe Islands, the Maltas, the Romanias, the North Macedonias of the world as well. And that's not nearly the same competition as Manchester United have in the Premier League. Those are matches that even without Bruno Fernandes, Portugal should be able to still get a result. If you take Bruno Fernandes out of the equation, even in a match against, say, Fulham, West Bromwich Albion, Sheffield United, it becomes a much harder match.
Well, it becomes a much harder match, but you're not just talking about a few simple Premier League games, right? They're in the thick of things with Europa League. Even though the fixtures are happening before the international break, They're playing Milan. So assuming if they can get past that very hard test, you know that you're going to need them in the next round and then in the quarters, semis, and then if they can make it that far, the finals. And I do believe that they are in cup competitions still. I don't recall which off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure, but
They're in the FA Cup, I believe.
Yeah, but exactly. So better yet, it's even more matches. And with the amount that Manchester United relies on Bruno playing that number 10, we've seen, you can say it for Manchester United, you can say it for Arsenal. I'll use those teams because I think it's comparable in that area. When you take out a very good number 10 out of both rosters, you see a lot of the creativity struggle, especially with Manchester United, the attack there, and with Arsenal, just the connection from the back to the front. So it's two different stories. Not going into that. That's a discussion that we've discussed, and that's something more for another day. However, I digress. At the same time, whether it be Bruno or someone like Fred, who's been a cornerstone in that midfield this season, Manchester United can't afford to lose these players. Let's go to another concern of the manager that I want to see your opinion on, Phil. And that would be players won't necessarily play the same position for their international team that they will at the domestic level. So if we stay with the Arsenal example, Bukayo Saka has had a phenomenal season playing on the right side of the attack. But if we look at that England side, we know how deep and how rich players up front, especially on the wings, are. Bukayo Saka, when he was playing all those 90s at the beginning of the season, he was playing them at left back. And while he has slotted into that position for Mikel Arteta a couple of times, you have to imagine that there is concern there that he is getting playing time, but he's not getting playing time in the position that he's been heavily used in. So I think that is also a fair concern. It's not obviously close to being as big a concern as injury on those players, but what do you think about that, Phil?
It's interesting that you bring that up, Alex. I don't think it should be really concern at all. I mean, it goes from player to player, obviously, but you look at a player like Weston McKennie, who plays for the US national team and for Juventus. I just use this because it's an easy example for me to use. Weston McKennie plays a central midfield role for the United States, and he's played it really well ever since starting for the US national team. That's where he's gained his reputation in the center of the pitch. He also plays now for Juventus, and now he plays more on the right side of that team in a right midfield kind of role. And I don't think him getting experience when he's coming back to the United States, playing for the United States on the national team, and then going to and from Juventus, I don't think it's had too much of an impact on his quality of play in either role. Now, translating a Weston McKennie to Bukayo Saka is trying to compare apples and oranges, but I don't think it's too big really of a concern unless you see a player on the national team playing a lot better in one position than he is playing in his role for the club domestically, if that makes any sense.
No, I mean, it definitely does make sense. Obviously, these players are versatile enough and they are savvy enough to be able to make the switch. So I do agree that wouldn't be as big of a concern. However, let's get to the last point, and the biggest underlining concern is that 10-day null period that especially players in England, and this is what has sparked this whole debate, especially those comments from Solskjaer, is that 10-day quarantine period. If you look at the calendar quickly, I don't know if there are any cup matches, but if we talk Premier League specifically, there's 2 match days occurring in that 10-day window. So if you look at Manchester United specifically, their first match is against Brighton, which obviously Brighton will always give you a run for your money, being a strong defensive side. And then after that, they have Spurs. So realistically, those are 2 big matches. Regardless who the opponent is, Manchester United is in the thick of things fighting for a top 4 position. So obviously, you're going to need all the firepower there, and you're going to need your players. And that's a concern for any team. Klopp has the right to be concerned. They've been short of men this entire season. they need all the points they can get because it's looking like they're going to be a fringe European team, not even Champions League, but Europe in general. If you look at, again, those other squads, like you said, with Ralph Hasenhutter and Southampton, yes, they are nulling. They're at the bottom half of the table. They're not particularly in a relegation fight, but they're close enough to be, they're 10 points above relegation, which is still close enough to be of concern. They're going to want to stay gunning, and they're going to want to shake off that shaky performance from a couple of weeks ago and continue moving and building upon that. Nonetheless, though, it will be really interesting to see how teams approach this and how teams can move forward. So why don't we end this podcast off, Phil? If you had to go with your gut instinct, will we see managers this coming international break more than ever say to their players, no, you're not allowed to go off on international duty?
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say it's going to stay par for the course. And it's mainly because, like I said before, in other areas of the world, it's been commonplace. In the MLS, it's been commonplace every year that players will lose some of their top players to the international break for a couple of weeks, and they'll just have to fend without them. We saw this being a crucial defining moment for Toronto FC the year that they won the MLS Cup. They went without Josie Altidore and Michael Bradley for 2 whole weeks while we're on the international break, had to scramble for players to start for them, and still were able to keep up their run of form. Now, I'm not saying Manchester United are going to be able to do the same thing Toronto FC were without Bruno Fernandes if he has to miss 10 days due to a quarantine. However, I don't think with what other leagues have gone through, this is really of huge concern unless players start actually getting coronavirus on international break.
Yeah, I have to stand on the other side of the fence with this argument. I do think that this window this international break, more than any before, we will see managers put their foot down and say, no, player X, Y, and Z, you can't go. I'm not sure off the top of my head what quarantine restrictions are from the other European countries, and we know this is why Europa League fixtures have to be played in other countries that aren't red listed. But at the end of the day, with how close things are in the Premier League, and if you look at a lot of those big teams who are fighting injury problems and who are in the thick of things, whether it be in European competition or fighting for a top 6-7 position in the Premier League, I can see managers putting their foot down saying, no, you've been injured enough this season, or no, you've gone enough playing time for us to be concerned about you going out and playing on international duty, that you'll need to stay back. I can see a good chunk of the Premier League teams holding back some of their bigger players.
It'll be interesting to see, Alex, what happens with that. And if this does happen, if this ability for managers in special circumstances to withhold players from international duty becomes more commonplace in the future.
So that's it for this week's episode. Thank you guys again so very much for tuning in.
And remember, meat first, soccer second. Have a great week.